We're just going to record and hope the battery doesn't die. Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to the Morning Bible. I have wet hair, but I am back. Location change once again. Back down below the Scottish border. I hope you're all doing well. So you remember last time we left off with Jesus being crucified on the cross. He was hanging there between the two criminals, the two robbers. And one of them says, "Oh, if you're the Son of God, then jump down and save yourself." The other robber tells that guy off, saying, No, don't you realise who this person is? And then he turns to Jesus and he says, "Lord, forgive me, remember me when you get into heaven." And Jesus says, "Yeah, you're going to be in paradise with me today." And so it's this beautiful story of, even though this guy's hanging on the cross, he can still be redeemed. And even though Jesus is in the midst of all this pain, all this suffering, he's got so much going on, he still has time for this one guy, this one criminal who's next to him. It kind of shows Jesus' attitude. So that was Jesus up on the cross. But this passage today is about the death of Jesus. So we're going to be going from verse 44 in Luke 23. It was now about the 6th hour, and there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour, when the sun's light failed. And the curtain of the temple was torn in two. Then Jesus, calling out with a loud voice, said, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." And having said this, he breathed his last. Now when the Centurion saw what had taken place, he praised God, saying, "Certainly this man was innocent." And all the crowds that assembled for this spectacle, when they saw what had taken place, returned home, beating their breasts. And all his acquaintances and the women who had followed him from Galilee stood at a distance, watching these things. So this is the passage where Jesus dies. There isn't tons of sort of detail around them checking. So in other Gospels, they sort of pierce Jesus' side with a spear to check that he's dead. But in this one, this is the account that we get. And so let's go through it bit by bit. It was now the 6th hour, and there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. So the 6th hour and the 9th hour mean different things. It doesn't mean 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. or 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. The 6th hour would have been the 6th hour of the working day. So that would have been around noon. If you imagine sort of the day starts at 6 a.m., you go until noon. So it starts from the 6th hour and it goes to the 9th hour, which is 3 p.m. So 3 hours going from midday into the afternoon. And there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour, while the sun's light failed. So this isn't the time where the sun's light would be failing, right? If it was in the evening, it would make sense. It's like, oh yeah, of course it's going dark, it's nighttime now. But this is right at the brightest point of the day. And remember, we're in the Middle East, so you know that the sun is in the sky there. But the sun's light is failing. Even the sun, is failing in response to what Jesus is doing on this cross. It's one of those things that when you read it and you read 6th to 9th hour, you go, oh, evening's coming. It's like, no. This is right in the middle of the day, and the sun isn't working properly. One of the theories out there is that it was a solar eclipse, but there's very little to no evidence for that, so discount that if someone kind of brings that to you. Just take what's written in scripture, and it's saying the sun's light failed. And it says, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two. So we'll come back to this at the end because it's actually quite meaningful, but we'll leave it for now. We'll look at the rest of the passage, and then right at the end we'll talk about what that actually means. Then Jesus, calling out with a loud voice, said, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." And having said this, he breathed his last. So these are the last things that Jesus say in this gospel. He says some other things in the other gospels. It's safe to say he said all of these things, but Luke says this is the last thing he said, was, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." So it isn't, this grand teaching, this grand statement. It just shows how rooted Jesus is in God's love. Being the Son of God, even though he prayed before, "Father, take this cup from me," even though he was in the Garden of Gethsemane sort of with blood pouring out his skin because he was praying so hard, even though he went through this flogging, this beating, he was nailed onto this cross for saying that he was the Son of God, even then he still calls God his Father, and he commits his spirit into God's hands. He doesn't fear death in the same way that we do. He doesn't fear death, because he isn't saying, Father, get me down from this cross. Father, help me escape. Father, help me avoid this. I don't want to die. He says, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. There's this trust that Jesus has with his Father. He's saying, look, I'm happy for you to take control now, for you to step in and catch me and take me with you. And having said this, he breathed his last. Now when the centurion saw what had taken place, he praised God, saying, certainly this man was innocent. So the centurion, this is the first time that we get a centurion called out specifically like this. Before it's just sort of groups of soldiers, etc. But in the Roman Empire, a centurion would have been someone who was in charge of a group of soldiers. Traditionally it's always been understood to be 100, but they think maybe now that it might have been like 80 people or 120, we don't know. Centurion, he was in charge of around 100 people. So he's a fairly senior officer, and he would have been the guy who was overseeing all of this. So he would have seen Jesus' arrest, he would have seen Jesus taken through various trials, Jesus sent between Pilate and Herod, and then Jesus being beaten, Jesus being walked to the cross, Jesus being nailed on it and hanging there and now dying. He's seen the whole set of events, right? And so he says, certainly this man was innocent. My notes in my Bible have quite a good description of it, actually. It says, what he saw includes Jesus' behaviour towards his enemies, the words spoken to a repentant criminal, the supernatural darkness, Jesus' prayer, and his giving up of his life. Although this is not the most as theologically profound as statements in Matthew, where there's a different thing he says, for Luke, this confession is important and serves as the culminating expression of Jesus' innocence. So, what does that mean? Well, Jesus' innocence has been something that Luke has been mentioning again and again and again in this gospel. It's something that he's kept coming back to, saying that Pilate found him innocent, that Herod found him innocent, that, even in the trial when they sort of kind of caught him out, it was obvious that Jesus was still innocent. Luke keeps coming back to the fact that Jesus is innocent. It's something that he's really trying to nail home in all these passages. And so having a centurion express Jesus' innocence is the ultimate way of sort of culminating that. It's this realization from the people responsible for Jesus going up on this cross, a representative of the Roman Empire. It's these people suddenly realizing, oh, this man was innocent. This man surely is the Son of God. Based on how Jesus treated that guy up on the cross, based on Jesus' behaviour all the way through the trials, this is an innocent man. And this centurion, the guy who was charged with killing Jesus, knew this and saw this. And so it's kind of this ultimate tying up of Jesus' innocence. And all the crowds that had assembled for this spectacle, when they saw what had taken place, returned home beating their breasts. So this was a common expression of sort of grief and sorrow, and sort of shame and pain and all these sort of difficult emotions. Throughout the Bible, the Jewish people do this very often. They'll sort of tear their clothes and beat their breasts. When King David had committed adultery, and he was kind of caught out in this, and called out by one of his officials. David's response is to go into this time of mourning, where he beats his breast and he says, I've done something terrible, I've done something awful. And you see that throughout. You see it whenever there's a big death, the death of like a major prophet or a major figure in the Jewish faith. Everyone's beating their breasts, and so you see that again here, they're beating their breasts. The crowds who had assembled for this spectacle, so it doesn't necessarily say they're his followers. A lot of them would have been there because this is a big event that's happening in town, and all of these people returned home beating their breasts. All of them are saddened by what they've seen. And all of his acquaintances and the women who had followed him from Galilee stood at a distance watching these things. So it specifically mentions the women who had followed him. We haven't heard about these women for a few chapters now, but we're told that they're still with him. And this will become important because it's these women who actually discover Jesus' body is missing. But they followed him all the way from Galilee, all the way to the cross. This group of women have been called out specifically for their faith and their commitment to Jesus, that they've been with him from the very beginning of his ministry all the way to him hanging on the cross. They've followed him, they've been with him the entire time. And so I think that's partially why they're mentioned as sort of an affirmation of their faith in the Bible. And they stood at a distance watching these things. They weren't in amongst the crowd. They weren't sort of talking to Jesus. They weren't doing all this. They were stood at a distance so they could see everything that was going on. So they saw it all. So that is where we're going to end today's passage. But let's just jump back quickly to the curtain in the temple was torn in two. So the rest of this passage all kind of makes sense if you don't have sort of the established Bible knowledge. Like you can jump into this passage and it's all like, oh yeah, of course that makes sense. But there's a random throwaway line where the curtain in the temple is torn too. Suddenly we go from Jesus hanging on the cross to the temple in Jerusalem, and there's a curtain in it and it's been ripped, and now we're back on the cross. And it's like, what on earth does that mean? Well, what it means, I haven't picked out the specific passages for this one today, sorry, but when in the Old Testament, with the whole set of laws that we get given in various books, there are a lot of instructions about how to set up the tent of God. So there's this thing called the Ark of the Covenant, where these things called the stone tablets with the 10 Commandments on them are kept. So most people will know the 10 Commandments. It's a list of instructions that God gave to Moses on top of Mount Sinai. There's a lot of information, I know, so just bear with me. God gave these directly to Moses. They were seen as super, super holy. They were put in the Ark of the Covenant, which is sort of this box that was used to carry them. And this Ark of the Covenant lived in this tent for a long time, where the Jewish people all lived in tents. But there were specific instructions for how to prepare the tent. So there was a room for the ark to be in, separate from everything else, and there was a mercy seat, and everything's covered in gold, and there's very specific sort of dimensions we get given in the Bible. We could recreate this tent today from the specific instructions that we're given. And then this went on to find its home in Jerusalem, where it became the temple. So instead of being this tent with these specific instructions, a temple was constructed instead. But the important thing here is that there was a curtain in the middle of the temple, and the curtain separated the presence of God from the rest of the people, right? Ordinary people weren't allowed to go into this space. There was the holy place and there was the most holy. There was the Holy of Holies, which is like this super, super holy kind of God's presence is in this space. And only one specific kind of chief priest was allowed to go in there very occasionally. There's very strict rules about how to do it, about all the sacrifices and ceremonies and cleansing you had to do before you could go in there. And it was a very rare occasion because God's presence was very much in this space, right? And there was a curtain that was between God's presence and everyone else who was outside the temple. If you came to visit the temple, you wouldn't go into that bit, but you would sort of come near to it, and there'd always be a curtain separating it from you. But now, this curtain's been torn in two. And so it's for a specific reason that it happens here. It happens when Jesus dies on the cross. When Jesus dies, that curtain is ripped, right? So what does that mean? That means God's presence isn't just kept in this space anymore. God's presence is free to come out of this space, and we're free to go into this space, and it's all just kind of mixed in. It's like if you had like an airlock with air on one side of it, air on the other side, and there's a door in the middle, and you just drop that door and suddenly it's all free, right? That's the image we get from the curtain in the temple being torn in two. It's this supernatural thing where this curtain just tears open. And God's presence is free. God's presence goes where it wants to. And that's not saying God's presence wasn't free before, but it's saying that there's now no divide between us and God, right? And so the reason for that is because as people we sin, we do things wrong, right? Jesus didn't, we do. We do things wrong all the time. We sin constantly. And every time we sin, it puts this curtain, this barrier between us and God, because God is perfect and we are not. So we can't possibly interact with God, because of this sin that's pulling us away from him, that's separating us. And so Jesus dying on the cross, he takes all of the sin that all the people have done up to that point in history, and all the sin that's happened after, all of the sin that we're doing today, and all the sin that's going to be coming tomorrow. All of those things go onto Jesus' back when he's on that cross. And so when he dies, that curtain is torn in two. That curtain of sin, that wall that separates us, is torn in two. And so now we can enter into God's presence. Now we are allowed to, because Jesus has taken all the things that we've done wrong and he's died with them. He's taken all of them with him. He's faced the punishment, faced the judgment for all those things. And now all we have to do is go to him and lay these things down at the cross. That doesn't mean a physical pilgrimage to actually go to where the cross was and, put down a list of sins at the bottom of it. That means we sit down and we pray and we say, Father, I'm sorry for the things I've done. And so when we talk about laying things down at the cross, giving things up to Jesus, turning away from sin, that's what it means. It's about praying this prayer that recognises that Jesus took all of this stuff onto him and died with all of it. He took it down to the grave so it has no power over us anymore. And now that curtain is torn in two and we can enter into God's presence. We can feel God's presence. We can be with him. And so that's the sort of power of the curtain of the temple torn in two. It's a really short sentence, and in just a few words, it tells us this massive theological concept, right? That sort of the rest of the Bible from here on out just spends unpacking, and sort of talking about it in all the letters. And they're sort of unpacking this concept that the curtain's been torn in two, that we can now enter into God's presence, that Jesus now forgives. It's a huge thing to explain, and it's why I love the Gospels especially, is because you get such a huge concept like that just told to you in a simple sentence, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two. That's all that sentence is, and it gives us so much sort of understanding of why Jesus came and what he's done for us. So that's where we're going to end today's passage. Tomorrow we're going to be finishing off chapter 23, talking about Jesus' burial. But for now, I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I'll see you all tomorrow. Bye.